In May 2023, operators behind the Kel0p ransomware campaign began exploiting CVE 2023-34362, a SQL injection vulnerability in MOVEit transfer. The vulnerability required no credentials. An unauthenticated HTTP request to a specific endpoint with a crafted SQL payload allowed the attacker to execute commands in the context of the MOVEit application's database account. The MOVEit application's database account was a database administrator. From that position, the attacker could create new admin users in the MOVEit system, read every stored file transfer, and exfiltrate data from every connected organization. More than 2,000 organizations were affected. Over 60 million records were exposed. The starting point was a single unauthenticated request. The ending point was full administrative control of every file and user in the system. The escalation took one step. That step was available because the application had been granted more database privilege than it needed to function. The SQL injection let the attacker make requests through the application's identity, requests the application itself was authorized to make. The permission system evaluated those requests correctly and granted them. Nothing broke. This is the structural logic of privilege escalation in almost all of its real-world forms. The attacker is not creating access. They are discovering access the permission system has already made available through a vulnerability, a misconfiguration, an overgranted permission, or a combination of individually legitimate assignments. The escalation path existed before the attacker arrived. The attacker's contribution was finding it and tracing it. Privilege escalation describes two distinct movements. Vertical escalation is the movement to a higher privilege level within the same system, from a standard user account to administrator, from an application identity to database administrator, from a cloud user to account owner. Horizontal escalation is the movement across peer-level accounts that hold different access, from one user's data to another's, from one service account's scope to a different service account with different permissions. Both follow the same underlying logic, reaching access that was not deliberately granted to the starting position. On Linux systems, the SUID bit is one of the most direct vertical escalation mechanisms. A binary with the SUID bit set executes with the file owner's permissions, regardless of who invokes it. A SUID binary owned by root that contains an exploitable vulnerability, a command injection, a buffer overflow, a writable path, gives the attacker a root shell. They did not compromise the root account. They inherited its permissions through the binary's execution context. The escalation requires one vulnerable binary. Most production Linux systems contain several SUID binaries that legitimate software requires. The question is not whether they exist, it is whether any of them are reachable and exploitable from the attacker's starting position. On Windows, the SeImpersonatePrivilege grants the holder the ability to impersonate any client that authenticates to it. The privilege is assigned by default to many service accounts, IIS application pools, SQL Server services, most Windows services generally, because those services legitimately need to act on behalf of the users they serve. The potato attack family, rotten potato, juicy potato, print spoofer, all exploit this privilege to impersonate the system account, the highest local privilege on a Windows machine. Compromising a service account with SeImpersonatePrivilege is frequently one API call from full local system access. The service account was not an administrator. It did not need to be. The privilege it legitimately held was sufficient to become one. In cloud environments, the most widely applicable escalation path centers on a single AWS permission, PassRole. PassRole allows an identity to associate an IAM role with an AWS service, a Lambda function, an EC2 instance, an ECS task. The permission sounds narrow. You are passing a role to a service. You are not assuming the role yourself. That distinction is where the escalation lives. An identity with PassRole and Lambda create function can create a Lambda function and pass any role it is permitted to pass to that function. If the role it can pass carries administrator access, the Lambda executes with administrator access. The attacker creates the Lambda, invokes it, and performs any action the administrative role permits, without ever directly holding that role. The permission system evaluated each step correctly. PassRole permitted the role association. Lambda create function permitted the function creation. The combination produced full account compromise from an identity that held neither permission individually at the level that mattered. Rhino Security Labs documented 21 distinct escalation paths to elevated AWS privileges using only legitimate IAM API calls. PassRole appears in the majority of them. None of the 21 paths requires a CVE. Each uses permissions that are common in production environments and individually appear unremarkable. Call the total of all such paths in an environment its escalation surface. The escalation surface is the set of all permission gaps reachable from a given starting position that can be chained into a path to higher privilege. Every environment has one. Its size depends on how permissions are structured, what is overgranted relative to what it needs to function, and how many reachable escalation primitives, SUID binaries, impersonation privileges, PassRole eligible roles, exist within reach of the foothold. The relationship between the vulnerability surface and the escalation surface is not the same as the relationship between a locked door and an open one. Reducing the vulnerability surface, patching, hardening, scanning, reduces the number of starting points an external attacker can obtain. It does not reduce the escalation surface that begins from those starting points. An attacker who lands anywhere inside a perimeter at low privilege faces whatever escalation surface begins there. That surface is governed by the permission structure, not the network boundary. Elevation of privilege vulnerabilities accounted for 40% of all 1,360 Microsoft CVEs published in 2024, the fifth consecutive year as the leading vulnerability category. The number reflects what attackers already understand. Obtaining a foothold is rarely the hard problem. The privilege level available from wherever that foothold lands is the variable that determines what the breach can reach. Every environment has an escalation surface. The security question is whether anyone has mapped it before the attacker does.